So last week here on the channel, we discussed players that, based on how they're perceived by the average fan, I deemed were a bit overrated, which is of course a naturally contentious topic, but now that we've gotten that out of the way, it's only right to flip over to the opposite end of the spectrum and speak more kindly about some players. For today's and tomorrow's videos, we will be going through every team in the NBA identifying the most underrated players on their roster, and by that, I mean that these are the players who are performing incredibly well in their roles and impact the team in a way that is honestly greater than they tend to get credit for by the average fan. For today's video, we'll be going through the teams in the Eastern Conference, and then in tomorrow's video, we will finish things up by going through the teams in the Western Conference, so be sure to stay tuned for that as well. Before we start though, I want to thank PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. PrizePicks is the perfect service for all of us basketball fans here because when you're involved, it makes watching games every night so much more fun and engaging. Basically, it's an application that provides you with lines on all kinds of individual player props, such as points, rebounds, assists, three-pointers made amongst others, and you simply have to choose whether you believe they will record over the set amount in the line or under the set amount in the line. Make your selections, wager however much you want to, and if your picks hit, you can win some big money. For some picks that I'm looking at making for today's slate of games, I'm thinking of going with Jordan Poole to score over 25.5 points, Desmond Bane to score over 20.5 points, and Nikola Jokic to dish out over 7.5 assists. If this sounds at all intriguing to you, then go use the link down in the description of the video to sign up today, and use promo code REFERENCE to receive a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. Once again, thank you to PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the topic at hand. Going in alphabetical order by team, we'll start with the Atlanta Hawks, and their most underrated player right now is Onyeka Okongwu. Okongwu was the team's lottery pick from the 2020 NBA draft, and after a few injuries that hampered the early part of his season this year, he's been getting better and better with each passing game. When it comes to his upside defensively, the sky is the limit, and offensively he's making 70% of his shots, which shows how well he operates alongside a playmaker like Trae Young, and the team is also 4 points better when he's on the court compared to when he's on the bench, so he may end up overtaking Clint Capella for the starting job sooner rather than later. Next up is the Boston Celtics, and their most underrated player right now is Robert Williams. It's unfortunate that just this morning news broke that he tore his meniscus and might miss the rest of the season because losing him will be a huge blow to the red-hot Celtics. The Celtics' success has stemmed from their top-ranked defense, and Robert Williams was at the heart of that defensive dominance with his work in the paint. He should have been a legitimate Defensive Player of the Year candidate this year, but there just hasn't been any real noise about him winning that award. Up next is the Brooklyn Nets, and their most underrated player is Seth Curry. Curry is always landing on lists like this simply because of who his brother is, which has overshadowed a lot of what he's been able to do as a player. Seth himself continues to be one of the best shooters in the league, and when he was attached in the trade for James Harden, he was the piece that made the deal happen, not just a throw-in as a sweetener. Next up is the Charlotte Hornets, and their most underrated player right now is Terry Rozier. LaMelo Ball is the face of this new Hornets core, and even Miles Bridges and his explosive athleticism get talked about as being the two guys leading the way for them, but Rozier is also quietly averaging about 20 points per game and providing phenomenal volume three-point shooting to help the Hornets produce as much as they do offensively. Up next is the Chicago Bulls, and their most underrated player is Lonzo Ball. Lonzo came to the Bulls this offseason and has been the perfect lineup balancing glue guy for them, and the fact that the team was sitting atop the Eastern Conference standings early on backed that up. Since Lonzo's been injured though, the Bulls have dropped down to 5th place in the standings, and they clearly miss his shooting, perimeter defense, and playmaking. Next up is the Cleveland Cavaliers, and their most underrated player right now is Kevin Love. The story regarding the Cavaliers' young core leading them into playoff contention is definitely amazing, don't get me wrong, but we can't forget about this veteran forward embracing a bench role and giving them instant impact when he subs in. He's still a strong rebounder, he makes a reliable 39% of his threes, and can go get them a bucket in the post when all else fails, which helps when you're surrounded by so many young players in big roles like there are around him. Up next, we have the Detroit Pistons, and their most underrated player is honestly Cade Cunningham. After being drafted first overall in last year's draft, his season started a bit slow due to injuries and disappointing early production, and because of that, players like Evan Mobley and Scotty Barnes have dominated the Rookie of the Year race for the most part this year. But now Cunningham is producing at a phenomenal level for a rookie, and genuinely deserves more buzz for the Rookie of the Year award than he's been getting, as he's been averaging about 22 points and 7 assists per game over the last month of play. Next up is the Indiana Pacers, and their most underrated player is Buddy Hield. Hield was also a part of the Tyrese Halliburton for Domantas Sabonis trade, but nobody ever really focused on his inclusion, treating him like an afterthought. Hield is still a strong volume shooter, and in Indiana, he's been producing pretty well across the board. Up next, we have the Miami Heat, and their most underrated player is Bam Adebayo. Honestly, if I had to pick right now who I would choose for the Defensive Player of the Year award, I would probably go with Adebayo, and the fact that he missed a decent amount of time early on in the season doesn't really change my mind. The Heat's already top 5 ranked defense gets 4.5 points better on that end when Adebayo is in the game. He defends positions 1 through 5 flawlessly, and even offensively, he's averaging a career-high 19 points per game this season. Next up is the Milwaukee Bucks, and their most underrated player right now is Jrue Holiday. Giannis is obviously the face of the franchise, but then Chris Middleton got named an All-Star this season as well, when I'm not so sure that Middleton has been the team's second best player over Jrue Holiday. I know they play different positions, so the voting wasn't quite the same, but it still represents that Jrue's season where he's scoring a highly efficient 19 points per game, playing strong defense as always, and shooting over 40% from 3 for the first time ever are being overlooked. Next up is the New York Knicks, and their most underrated player is RJ Barrett. Because the Knicks as a whole have been pretty disappointing this season, the fact that RJ has really started to emerge over the last few months just isn't being talked about enough. On the season as a whole, he's averaging about 20 points per game, but over the last 2 months, he's been averaging about 26 points per game, and his work as an aggressive driver and finisher at the basket has been taken to another level. Next up is the Orlando Magic, and their most underrated player right now is Wendell Carter. Wendell Carter has been the Magic's best player this season, but because the Magic have been rebuilding and at the bottom of the standings the whole time, nobody really talks about it. He's averaging 15 points and 10 rebounds per game, he's a stout defender, and he's even becoming a savvy playmaker for a center. Up next, we have the Philadelphia 76ers, and their most underrated player is Tyrese Maxey. When Harden arrived in Philadelphia, most people looked at Embiid, Harden, and Tobias Harris being their 3 go-to guys, but Maxey has shown that he's the team's real third option. On the season, he's averaging about 17 points a game, shooting 48% from the field and 42% from 3, so he's been unbelievably efficient, and those numbers have improved even more since James Harden's arrival in the team, so down the line, Maxey has legitimate star potential. Next up, we have the Toronto Raptors, and their most underrated player is Pascal Siakam. Siakam got written off as an overrated player by so many people over the last few years that he has now reached the opposite end of the spectrum where nobody really gives him any credit for how good he really is. In my opinion, Siakam deserved to be an all-star this season because his work to help keep the Raptors in the playoffs with solid production across the board is way too slept on. And finally, the last team up in the Eastern Conference is the Washington Wizards, and their most underrated player is Kyle Kuzma. Kuzma is no longer in the bright Los Angeles lights, which is probably for the best, because he has settled into his role nicely in Washington and looks like a brand new, more confident player because of it. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think is underrated in the Eastern Conference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.